Hello lovely patrons, welcome back to another Patreon exclusive video. Today is a requested video. I believe it was Brianne Holroyd. Sorry, that may be wrong. I will pop on the screen who requested it. I think it was one of the Briannes, and it was a great suggestion because it was how to know whether or not a vintage piece is worth spending the money on. That's a really good point. I hadn't really thought about this. I think because a lot of the time when I buy vintage based on what I want, but obviously vintage is an investment, and also if you haven't kind of spent your whole life around costumers and people who know a lot about clothing, you might not have that inherent knowledge of what is and isn't worth spending the money on. I also know quite a lot of vintage sellers and dealers, and so I'm aware of how much they sell their pieces for and also what they have in stock. I'm not hugely knowledgeable on famous labels, but usually if a label is on a garment, I will look it up and I get to know them that way, but I don't tend to look for like holy grails like that. My holy grails are like personal items that I really want, not necessarily holy grails in the sense of like a really sought after label or particular item that like everyone is after. So I thought I would delve further into that topic today and let you guys know how I go about deciding whether or not something is worth spending the money on. Let's get started.
What have you got if you haven't got love?
I have my coffee here and my dog. I feel like a Bond villain with Louis in my lap. Okay, so when I go vintage shopping, and this applies to the physical shopping process, I've talked about shopping online and how I sort of do that. I can delve into that further if you guys have more specific questions, but I thought I would talk about actually going physically to thrift stores and vintage stores and antique stores looking for vintage pieces. I always take a tape measure with me just to check the items, and sometimes, you never know, you might have fluctuated a little bit and you might know your clothing size, but it's funny how sometimes, with vintage clothing, there's not much stretch. And so if you can't try the item on, it is really good to be able to just whip the tape measure out and check your measurement and check the measurement of the garment. So I highly recommend that. I also recommend it for checking the length of dresses and things, because so often beautiful vintage pieces have been ruined because someone has taken like a lovely 1950s dress and made it like a mini or a knee length dress. And so when you put it on, it might not matter to you, but value wise, once they've chopped the bottom of the dress off, or if they've done a bad job or it's been cut off a long time ago, even if you take the hem down, it's going to have the line, like the permanent kind of faded line around the bottom of it. So that's something to think about. I like to measure the length of the dress and see where it's going to fall on me. Obviously you can hold it up against yourself, but if you want to be really accurate, if it's only a small amount of difference or they've, changed it this much, it can be easier to actually measure it waist to hemline. It also really helps if you just want to be shopping for items for friends or gifts, or if you want to know how much you're going to have to take an item in, etc. Just having a tape measure with you is a really, really good idea, especially in antique stores because they often don't have a change room, and holding something up against yourself is not a good way to measure, because I have had so many vintage garments that I just couldn't zip up. I could get it on, but I could not zip it up or button it up because it's like this much too small. So making sure that you have your tape measure with you, definitely. I know that's not really about the value of the item, but it is a waste of money if you've bought something, especially if it's something that you like, but you can't necessarily sell on to somebody else, because not everything is sought after vintage wise, so sometimes you can grab something that you like and then have real trouble passing it on. So I would think about what you purchase and whether or not it fits you, and whether or not you want to just buy stuff because it's vintage, because sometimes you can spend a lot of money and not get that money back again. The other thing I always take with me is my smartphone. I'm constantly going on Etsy in particular and looking up the value of pieces that are similar to things that I'm looking at. So say I pick up a 1960s shift dress, I will jump onto Etsy and I will type in 1960s shift dress, and I will start, or like flower power dress or whatever the garment may be. I'll just try and use the keywords to narrow down the search as much as I can, and then I will go through several pages to get an idea of what the rough value of the item is, because inevitably some people list things really cheap, some people list them super expensive. So I try to find stuff that is in the cheaper end. For me personally, I'm obviously trying to resell on my Vintage Tips and Tricks shop, so I want to try and make my money back, but also pay myself for the time that I spend looking for vintage items, because obviously it takes time and energy and knowledge, and I need to make sure that I can make enough of a margin spend on a garment. But for you guys, I would aim to buy things that are middle of the road, because inevitably, like with anything, even though like it's so exciting to find a vintage piece, over time our styles do change. So unless something is a really special piece, you know, like it's a designer label or something that you know you are going to wear forever, like a classic little black dress or something that you've just been looking for years and never gotten over the idea of, that might be worth spending the big bucks on. But otherwise, I would go for a middle of the road pricing and not spend too high an amount. Even though the item might be worth it, you know, if you don't think you're going to wear it forever, you're going to want to resell it at some point, and you need to be able to make your money back. Most of the time vintage goes up in value, but for everyday vintage it can really fluctuate, and it depends on the person buying as to how much they'll spend on it. So yeah, I would aim for the cheaper end of the rung that you find on Etsy to the mid-range. The other thing is to research designers. You don't have to remember all off the top of your head. As I say, I just take my smartphone with me, and if I find a label inside a garment, I will search the label. The Vintage Fashion Guild has a label catalog that tells you about the different designers and what that label is and what makes it special. And then of course you can again search for that label on Etsy to see what other people are selling the pieces by that designer at what price. And the other thing is just to know whether or not, you know, you've stumbled across a bargain, because sometimes you'll be in a thrift store or an antique store and they've popped some amazing piece like a Shaheen, or, you know, heaven forbid you find like a Fred A block or something and they've just chucked it on the rack for like 20, 30, 40, even 50 pounds. Like, even if you found a Fred A block for like 70 pounds, I'd probably buy it. People spend hundreds of pounds on that stuff. So if you see a label with a name, like the designer's name inside, it's worth Googling the label. I mean, I have tons of stuff that has labels inside and I've Googled it and I cannot find anything. Like, no one is selling anything with that label. It might just be, you know, a boutique store or whatever. But sometimes you can stumble across something really special, and that's when, you know, it might be worth spending the big bucks. Even if you aren't going to keep it yourself, you might be able to sell it on and make a bit of cash and give it to someone who really wants it as well. My little man always sleeps on my arm, like just his neck. It's got to be so uncomfortable. So I have to like put his arms over my arms so that he falls asleep like that. I don't know why he always chooses the weirdest, most uncomfortable position. Do other people's dogs do that? Special little guy. The other thing is that I tend to shy away from vintage that's really standard unless it's super cheap. So if I'm finding stuff that's like a really plain colored everyday pencil skirt or blouse or something like that that I'm going to be wearing just around the house or to work, or, you know, that's going to get a lot of wear and tear and it's going to wear out like modern clothing would, then I don't really spend more than 5, 10, maybe 15 pounds per item on those kinds of things, because A, they're not that interesting and they can be hard to resell, and B, you're going to wear them a lot, and so they might wear out before you have the opportunity to resell them. So I don't spend much on those. I do pick up a lot of them because I like to wear vintage every day, but I try not to spend too much money on those items. I'll spend more money on stuff that has a beautiful pattern, an amazing cut, you know, special button details or lace collars or soutache, stuff like that, that is eye-catching. And if it's eye-catching to me, it's going to be eye-catching to someone else if I ever want to sell it on. So I guess I always keep in mind when I buy vintage, is this something that I can invest in, just like you would invest in stock or art or other things that gain value. When you invest in vintage, think about, is this a piece that someone else might want down the line in case I don't want it anymore, or in case I find I spent too much money on vintage and I need to get some of that money back again? Or you find something else you really want, you know, like you're trolling Etsy one day or eBay, or you find a vintage seller on Instagram and they have a piece that you really want, but it's like, you know, a couple of £100 or maybe even a lot more money than that. You could sell a bunch of your other vintage that is of less value to you, but for a decent price, to get that one like holy grail item. So I would always keep that in mind when you're shopping for vintage, is like, am I the only one that's going to like this? Is this something unusual? Again, not to say you wouldn't buy it, but what is the purpose of buying this? How long am I going to want it? And would someone else want to buy it? I definitely have videos on my YouTube channel about how to recognize vintage. So I would go and check those out again and make sure you're kind of brushed up on how to recognize vintage pieces. But I always turn everything inside out, have a look at the seams. If something is overlocked, I really think carefully about what other elements of the garment make it seem like it's from that era. And again, I will jump on Etsy and I will research whether other people's garments by that manufacturer or by that style have got overlocking in them as well, because there's things as early as like the 1940s with overlocking, but they tend to be mass manufactured. So keep in mind that those items are probably not super high value, but that's, you know, not a guaranteed thing. So it's just worth having your smartphone on you to check out stuff like that as well. And to make sure that not too many changes and repairs have been done, because sometimes a piece looks really beautiful on a hanger and then you get it home and you try it on and you realize that someone just got to it and it was much bigger and they've destroyed the shape, which means you're gonna have to spend a lot of money getting the piece tailored and repaired by a person who knows what they're doing, and that's expensive. It's worth spending the money on special pieces, but if it's an everyday item and you've spent like 50 pounds on it or 50 American dollars, and then yeah, you get it home and realize you're gonna have to pay someone like $100 to tailor it to fit you because some awful person who had no idea how to sew just destroyed the bust line or the waist or the hemline, or has like cut sections out of it, or yeah. So like just turn everything inside out and really check whether it's the original work, whether it's handmade, whether someone handmade the piece at home, or whether or not someone has butchered it. I bought a 1960s blouse off of eBay the other day. I spent hardly anything. I think it was only like £4 or £5 or something, which is fine, but I got it here and it said that it had been altered but could be easily returned. But when I got it here, I tried it on. They've done the weirdest alteration to the armpit where they've like folded it down on itself and it's been all chopped up, and it's bizarre, and it's going to be quite hard to work out where the original top seams had been because of all of the weird stuff they've done to it. Now that doesn't matter because I spent like £5 and I will be able to fix it, but realistically it's £5 that I've spent and I don't know how soon I'm going to get around to actually repairing it. So it's always worth keeping in mind, you know, it's easy to go into an antique store or a thrift store and find a section where they have a ton of vintage and then spend £5 per item or £10 per item, but then you've spent like 50, 60, 70 pounds on a bunch of stuff that you might not wear because it needs fixing, you know? So think about that factor as well. So there's like the value factor of you personally, how valuable is it to you? But then there's also the, what is the future value of the item? So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that, guys. There might be more to it that I'm not thinking of, but that's kind of how I go through my thought process when I'm thrifting and vintage shopping to try and decide what I will and won't buy. I hope it's helpful. We can always chat further in the comments. If you have any specific questions, let me know. Don't forget, you can always DM me. You get like direct line personal chats with me anytime that you like. I will happily answer you. Just send a message in Patreon through the message center and I will get back to you. So I hope it was helpful. I will see you in the next video and in the Patreon chat. Bye.